The air was still cold when Tom Anderson stepped out of his ranch house that October morning in 1973, his breath hanging in the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts. He'd raised cattle in eastern Colorado for 32 years, knew every sound his herd made, every rhythm of the land. But something felt wrong. The silence pressed against his ears, thick and unnatural. Not even the coyotes were calling. He found Big Red in the north pasture as the sun broke the horizon, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of amber and gold. The prize Hereford bull lay on its side, perfectly still, and for a moment, Tom thought the animal was simply resting. Then, he saw the face, or what remained of it. The bull's eyes had been removed, not torn or ripped, but extracted with such precision that the sockets appeared clean, almost surgical. The tongue was gone, severed deep in the throat, past where any predator could reach. And the reproductive organs, removed so carefully that the edges of the remaining tissue looked as though they'd been traced by a scalpel wielded by a trained surgeon's hand. Tom had butchered enough cattle to know what a knife wound looked like, what teeth marks revealed, how claws tore through hide and muscle. This was none of those things. The cuts were too perfect, too deliberate, too impossible. But it was what surrounded the carcass that made his hands begin to shake. The ground was bone dry. A bull the size of Big Red held gallons upon gallons of blood coursing through its body. Yet beneath the animal, around it, spreading out in every direction, there was nothing. No blood on the grass. No blood soaking into the earth. No blood anywhere. Tom walked a wide circle around the body, searching for tracks, for tire marks, for broken fence posts or disturbed vegetation. The frost was undisturbed. Not a footprint. Not a sign that anything or anyone had approached the animal. It was as if Big Red had been killed by something that left no trace of its presence. Something that could drain a 2,000-pound animal of its blood without spilling a single drop. He called the sheriff. He called the veterinarian. He called his neighbors. And as word spread through the county, others came forward with their own stories. A rancher 3 miles south had lost a heifer 2 weeks earlier. Same wounds, same bloodless scene. Another family 10 miles west found their horse mutilated in identical fashion the month before. All of them had stayed quiet, fearing ridicule, fearing something they couldn't name. What Tom Anderson discovered that morning wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched back decades and would continue for decades more. A pattern that would eventually encompass thousands of cases across North America and beyond. Cattle, horses, sheep, elk, found dead under circumstances that defied every natural explanation. The same organs removed again and again with mechanical precision. The same impossible absence of blood. The same lack of evidence pointing to any earthly perpetrator. Law enforcement officials investigated and found themselves baffled. Veterinarians examined the carcasses and could offer no conventional explanation for the surgical precision of the cuts. Ranchers, pragmatic people who dealt with life and death as part of their daily routine, found themselves afraid to walk their own land after dark. Because this wasn't the work of predators. Wolves and coyotes tear flesh, leave tracks, scatter remains. Mountain lions drag their kills to hidden places. Bears leave claw marks, disturb the surrounding area with their massive weight. Scavenger birds peck and rip, their feeding frenzied and obvious. This was something else entirely. Something that operated with purpose and method. Something that possessed technology or capability beyond what should be possible. Something that came in darkness and left before dawn, invisible and untraceable. The cases shared details so specific, so consistent across geography and time, that coincidence became impossible to accept. The removal of certain organs and tissue, always the same ones. The precision of the excisions, often described as showing evidence of heat or laser-like cutting. The complete drainage of blood from animals that should have painted the ground red. The absence of rigor mortis in some cases, suggesting the bodies had been moved or manipulated after death. And perhaps most disturbing, the reaction of other animals. Horses refusing to approach the site of a mutilation. Dogs whining and backing away, hackles raised. Cattle giving a wide berth to areas where their herd mates had fallen, even weeks later. Theories emerged, each attempting to impose order on chaos, to give name to the nameless. Some pointed to satanic cults, ritualistic killers operating in the darkness. Though no cult has ever been caught, no member ever confessed, no evidence of human presence ever discovered at the scene. Others suggested secret government experiments, black budget programs testing biological weapons, or studying the spread of diseases through livestock populations. Some ranchers came to believe they were dealing with something not of this earth, craft descending from night skies to harvest tissue for purposes beyond human comprehension. But theories are easy. Evidence is not. And in case after case, across thousands of investigations spanning 5 decades, the evidence leads nowhere. It simply stops at the edge of the impossible. What follows in this investigation will take you deep into the most disturbing cases. Mutilations witnessed in progress by terrified observers who saw lights in the sky. Incidents where military helicopters were seen in the area just hours before discoveries. Cases where the animals were found in locations they couldn't have reached on their own, as if dropped from above. Ranching families bankrupted by losses, driven from land their ancestors had worked for generations. Law enforcement officers who started their investigations as skeptics and ended them unable to sleep without lights on in their homes. You will hear from the veterinarians who examined these animals, trained professionals reduced to silence by what their expertise told them was impossible. From the ranchers who found their livelihoods destroyed and their sense of safety shattered. From the investigators who followed the pattern and found themselves staring into an abyss that offered no answers, only more questions. Every rational explanation will be explored. Every conventional theory will be tested against the evidence. And one by one, each will fail to account for what these carcasses reveal. Because something is operating in the darkness of rural America. Something with capability and purpose. Something that has continued its work for over 50 years without leaving behind a single piece of conclusive evidence, without making a single mistake, without being caught or identified or understood. Tom Anderson sold his ranch 18 months after finding Big Red. He never raised cattle again. When asked why, he would only say that there are some things a man doesn't need to understand twice. That some fears, once awakened, never go back to sleep. The mutilations continue to this day. The pattern persists. The mystery deepens. And somewhere, in the hours between midnight and dawn, another rancher is about to make a discovery that will change everything they thought they knew about the world and what inhabits it. The morning of September 9th, 1967, arrived cold and still in the San Luis Valley of Colorado. Nellie Lewis walked out to check on her horses at the ranch she shared with her mother, Agnes King, near the small town of Alamosa. The valley stretched around them, a high desert basin ringed by the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east, and the San Juan Range to the west. It was a landscape of scrub brush and sparse grass, where the air sat thin at 7,500 feet above sea level, and the sky seemed to press down with a weight that made everything beneath it feel exposed. Nellie had gone to check on Lady, a 3-year-old Appaloosa mare that her brother and sister-in-law had left in their care. The horse hadn't come in the previous evening, which was unusual but not yet alarming. Horses sometimes wandered in the valley, following the sparse vegetation or simply exploring the vast openness. But when Nellie walked beyond the property's edge and scanned the scrubland, what she saw stopped her completely. About a quarter mile from the ranch house, she spotted what remained of Lady. Even from a distance, something about the shape wasn't right. The form was too still, too precise in its wrongness. As Nellie approached, the true horror of what lay before her began to register. This wasn't simply a dead horse. This was something else entirely. The Appaloosa's carcass had been stripped of flesh from the shoulders forward. The entire head and neck were bare bone, gleaming white in the morning sun. The hide and muscle had been removed with such completeness that the skull seemed to glow against the brown earth. But the precision was what made Nellie's breath catch. The cuts where flesh met bone appeared clean, almost surgical. There were no ragged edges, no tearing, none of the mess you would expect from predators or scavengers. Nellie hurried back to the ranch house and told her mother what she'd found. Agnes King was a practical woman, not given to hysteria, but when the two of them returned to the site together, even she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. The horse's brain was gone, removed so completely that the skull cavity was empty and clean. The spinal fluid had been drained. Internal organs were missing. And yet, there was no blood on the ground, No blood on the exposed bones. No blood anywhere in the vicinity of the carcass. Agnes noticed something else. The animal's tracks approached the death site normally, clear hoofprints in the sandy soil. But approximately 100 feet from where the carcass lay, the tracks simply stopped. Not faded, not obscured. They ended abruptly, as if the horse had been plucked from the ground mid-stride. The two women walked carefully around the site, trying to understand what they were looking at. Near the body, a circular area of bushes and grass had been flattened, pressed down uniformly as if by some great weight. The circle measured roughly 15 feet across, and within it, the vegetation was crushed but not burned, compressed but not broken. Outside the circle, the scrub stood upright and undisturbed. When the local newspaper got word of the discovery, they mistakenly reported the horse's name as Snippy, and the name stuck. Within days, the story began to spread beyond the San Luis Valley. A dead horse with strange wounds might have remained a local oddity, but the details kept accumulating, each one stranger than the last. The Forest Service was called in. Local law enforcement examined the scene. And then came Dr. John Henry Altschuler, a pathologist and hematologist with training in forensic examination. Dr. Altschuler arrived at the site, expecting to solve a mystery quickly. He had experience with death, in various forms, and in 1967, the idea of livestock dying under mysterious circumstances wasn't entirely unknown. But what he found challenged his professional understanding of how death worked, how bodies decomposed, and what kinds of tools could produce such effects. He knelt beside the carcass and examined the incisions where flesh had been removed from bone. The cuts were clean and precise, made with what appeared to be a sharp instrument applied with perfect control. There was no tearing of tissue, no crushing of bone, no sawing marks. The edges of the cuts appeared cauterized, sealed as if by intense heat. But there were no burn marks on the surrounding tissue, no charring, no signs of the kind of thermal damage that conventional cauterization would produce. Dr. Altschuler took a scalpel from his kit and attempted to replicate the precision of the cuts on a small section of remaining tissue. Even with a surgical blade in his trained hand, he couldn't achieve the same smoothness. The tissue he cut showed the ragged microscopic tears that any blade produces when separating cells. The cuts on the horse showed no such tearing. At a microscopic level, the cells appeared to have been separated without damage, as if the flesh had simply decided to part. The internal examination was equally confounding. The brain cavity was completely empty. Not just the brain itself, but the membranes, the fluids, the small vessels and connective tissues. All of it had been removed. The spinal column showed a similar pattern. The spinal cord and all associated fluids were gone, extracted with a completeness that Dr. Altschuler couldn't explain. He couldn't identify any entry point large enough to account for the removal. There were no drill holes, no saw marks, no fractures that would indicate forced entry. He examined the horse for signs of struggle. There were none. The body showed no defensive wounds, no marks suggesting the animal had fought or thrashed. Whatever had happened to this horse had happened quickly, or the animal had been unable to resist. As Dr. Altschuler worked, others were examining the surrounding area with instruments of their own. Someone had brought a Geiger counter, and when they swept it near the carcass and over the flattened circle of vegetation, the readings spiked. The radiation levels were elevated, not dangerously high, but significantly above background levels for the area. The readings were highest near the carcass itself and within the circle of compressed plants. News crews began arriving. The story was spreading now, picked up by wire services and carried across the country. A dead horse in Colorado, with strange wounds and radiation readings, became a national curiosity in the autumn of 1967. This was the height of the Cold War, a time when Americans were acutely aware of radiation, of secret government projects, of the possibility that unknown technologies might be deployed without public knowledge. The theories multiplied. Some suggested a military experiment gone wrong. Some classified aircraft or weapon that had targeted the horse either deliberately or accidentally. Others pointed to the radiation readings as evidence of something more exotic, visitors from elsewhere using technologies we didn't understand. The flattened circle, the missing tracks, the surgical precision of the wounds. All of it suggested an intelligence, a purpose, a technology that exceeded conventional explanation. Local ranchers began checking their own herds more carefully. Within weeks, other animals were found with similar characteristics. Cattle, primarily, but also horses and sheep. The wounds showed the same precision. Organs were missing. Blood was absent. The pattern that began with Lady, nicknamed Snippy by a journalist who got the name wrong, was repeating itself across the valley and beyond. Dr. Altschuler filed his report, noting his observations and his inability to explain them through conventional means. He did not speculate wildly, but he was clear about what he had seen. The incisions were unlike anything produced by known predators or scavengers. The lack of blood was inconsistent with normal decomposition. The removal of specific organs suggested selection, intention, purpose. The case of Snippy established what would become a template, a checklist of characteristics that defined the phenomenon. Precise cuts with cauterized edges. Missing organs, particularly reproductive organs, eyes, tongues, and soft tissue from the head and neck. Absence of blood at the scene and in the carcass. No signs of struggle. No tracks approaching the body. Sometimes, circular depressions in the nearby ground. Sometimes, elevated radiation readings. Sometimes, reports of strange lights in the sky on the nights before the discoveries. In the decades that followed, thousands of similar cases would be reported across North America and beyond. Ranchers would find their cattle dead and mutilated with the same surgical precision. Law enforcement and veterinary experts would examine the carcasses and struggle to provide explanations. Some would insist on natural causes, on predators and decomposition, creating patterns that only seemed intentional. Others would acknowledge the strangeness, the recurring details that didn't fit comfortable explanations. But it all traced back to that morning in September 1967, when Nellie Lewis walked out into the San Luis Valley and found something that shouldn't exist. The horse that became known as Snippy was the first case to receive widespread attention, the first to be documented with photographs and pathology reports, the first to ignite public imagination and fear. The carcass eventually decomposed, as all bodies do, and the physical evidence faded. But the questions remained, written into the template that Snippy's death created. What could remove flesh from bone with such precision? What could drain a body of blood so completely? What could lift a horse from the ground and end its tracks mid-stride? And why? What purpose could such acts serve? These questions would echo through the years, repeated at ranch after ranch, case after case, as the phenomenon spread and persisted. The answers, if they exist, remain as elusive now as they were on that cold morning in 1967, when the mystery first revealed itself in the high desert of Colorado. The first rancher to find one that spring morning in 1973 thought a cougar must have gotten to his heifer. But when Tom Henderson approached the carcass in his pasture outside Dodge City, Kansas, he stopped walking 50 feet away. Something was wrong. The air felt different, too still, too quiet. Even the magpies that normally circled anything dead were absent from the sky. When he finally forced himself to move closer, he saw that the 3-year-old Hereford was lying on its side with no signs of struggle in the soft earth around it. The animal's eyes were gone, removed so precisely that the sockets appeared carved. The tongue had been extracted through a circular incision in the jaw. The udder had been removed with what looked like surgical precision. And there was no blood. Not on the animal, not on the ground, not anywhere. Henderson had ranched that land for 27 years. He had seen what coyotes do to cattle, what dogs do, what extreme weather does. This was something else entirely. He called the sheriff's department, and within hours, his property was swarming with deputies who had no explanation for what they were documenting. That single case in early 1973 might have remained a local oddity, a strange footnote in the records of Dodge City law enforcement. But within weeks, more cases emerged. Another rancher 30 miles north found 2 steers mutilated identically. Then a case in Nebraska. Then 3 in Colorado. By summer, the trickle had become a flood. Between 1973 and 1975, hundreds of cattle mutilation cases exploded across Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and South Dakota. What had been isolated incidents transformed into an epidemic that sent shockwaves through rural communities already struggling with economic pressures and isolation. Ranchers who had never locked their doors started sleeping with rifles beside their beds. The mutilations followed a pattern so consistent, so precise, that it defied every conventional explanation law enforcement could offer. The details were always the same, and that consistency terrified people more than random violence ever could. The incisions appeared to be made with surgical precision, edges so clean that local veterinarians said they looked cauterized, burned shut at a microscopic level. Some described them as laser-like, though in the mid-1970s, laser technology was still largely confined to research laboratories, and certainly not available to whoever or whatever was roaming the prairies at night. The targeted organs never varied. Eyes, always removed completely from the sockets. Tongues, extracted through neat incisions. Ears, taken with circular cuts. Reproductive organs, removed so precisely that veterinarians examining the carcasses couldn't understand how it was done without tearing surrounding tissue. In some cases, the rectum had been cored out in a perfect circle extending several inches into the body cavity. The precision was surgical, impossible to achieve in a dark field with an unrestrained animal. But the most disturbing detail was the blood. Every single animal was completely drained. Not a drop remained in the carcass, yet there was never any blood on the ground. No spray patterns, no pooling, nothing. Animals contain gallons of blood. A full-grown cow holds roughly 9 to 10 gallons. That volume doesn't simply disappear. Yet in case after case, investigators found carcasses lying on soft soil that would show every drop, every smear, and there was nothing. In Madison County, Nebraska, rancher Carl Morrison found one of his bulls dead in a pasture where recent rains had left the ground soft as cake flour. Morrison was certain he would find tracks, some evidence of who had killed his 1,500-pound bull. The animal was worth thousands of dollars, and Morrison needed answers. What he found instead deepened the mystery. The bull lay in the center of an open field, mutilated in the now familiar pattern. The ground around it was perfect for holding prints. Yet, there were no human footprints, no tire tracks, no animal tracks, nothing. The bull's own hoofprints leading to the spot were visible, but nothing else had disturbed that soft earth. When Sheriff Ben Matthews arrived to investigate, he walked the entire perimeter of the pasture looking for any point of entry. The fence was intact. The gate was locked from the inside. Matthews had been in law enforcement for 19 years and had worked everything from bar fights to murders. He knew how to read a crime scene. This one made no sense. He documented everything, took photographs, wrote detailed reports, and had absolutely nothing to show for it. No leads, no suspects, no theories that held up to basic scrutiny. Cases like Morrison's were happening weekly now, sometimes daily across the four-state region. The panic spread faster than any official investigation could contain. Ranchers in Logan County, Colorado formed armed patrols, groups of men who drove the back roads at night with hunting rifles and spotlights, determined to catch whoever was doing this. They found nothing. In Tripp County, South Dakota, ranchers organized a communication network using CB radios, creating a web of watchful eyes across thousands of acres. They reported strange lights occasionally, distant movements, odd sounds, but never caught anyone in the act. Sarah Beth Kowalski ranched with her husband outside of Kit Carson, Colorado. When they found their first mutilated calf in August of 1974, she insisted on staying up all night for the next 2 weeks, watching their remaining herd from the porch with her husband's rifle across her lap. She told a local reporter that the worst part wasn't the watching. It was the fear that had settled into their lives like a permanent guest. They had raised cattle for 12 years without incident. Now she was afraid to let their children play outside after dark. The mutilations had stolen more than livestock. They had stolen the sense of safety that rural life had always provided. Witnesses who discovered fresh mutilation sites consistently reported the same eerie phenomenon. Silence. Complete, unnatural silence. Ranchers described approaching carcasses and noticing that the normal sounds of the prairie had stopped. No insects, no birds, no wind sounds. Just an oppressive quiet that made them want to leave immediately. This silence, wasn't just absence of sound. People described it as a presence, something that pushed against their ears and made their skin crawl. Even more disturbing was the behavior of predators and scavengers. Under normal circumstances, a dead cow in a field would attract coyotes within hours, vultures and ravens by the next morning, insects immediately. But ranchers reported that mutilated carcasses would lie untouched for days, sometimes over a week. Coyotes would approach to within 100 yards and then retreat. Vultures would circle but not land. Dogs that normally investigated everything refused to go near the bodies. When decomposition finally began, and scavengers eventually approached, they reportedly avoided the areas where organs had been removed, feeding on other parts of the carcass instead. James Cutler, a veterinarian in Cheyenne County, Kansas, examined over 40 mutilated cattle during this period. He had studied animal medicine for 8 years and practiced for 15 more. He knew animal anatomy, understood predation patterns, could identify every disease and parasite that affected livestock in the region. None of his knowledge helped explain what he was seeing. The precision of the cuts was beyond anything he could achieve in a fully equipped surgical suite with a sedated animal, proper lighting, and hours to work. Someone or something was doing this in open fields, at night, with no evidence of restraining the animal, and completing the entire procedure without leaving a trace. Law enforcement agencies across the 4 states were overwhelmed. Sheriff's departments in rural counties typically dealt with property disputes, drunk driving, and the occasional domestic disturbance. Now they were fielding multiple calls per week about mutilated livestock, and they had nothing to offer the terrified ranchers. No suspects, no motives, no evidence that led anywhere. The FBI was contacted. They sent agents who examined cases, wrote reports, and provided no answers. In some counties, authorities suggested that predators were responsible, that coyotes and vultures had created the damage and ranchers were simply misinterpreting normal scavenging behavior. This explanation enraged the ranching community. These were people who had worked with animals their entire lives, who understood predator behavior intimately, who could read tracks and sign that city-trained investigators missed entirely. They knew what coyote kills looked like, what a pack of dogs did, how scavengers fed. This wasn't that. This was something else. The pattern consistency was what convinced even skeptical investigators that something genuinely strange was happening. If these were pranks, or the work of disturbed individuals, there would be variation. Copycats would get details wrong, add flourishes, and make mistakes. But across hundreds of cases spanning 4 states and 3 years, the mutilations were identical. The same organs, the same type of incisions, the same complete blood drainage, the same lack of evidence at the scene. By 1975, the epidemic had created a climate of genuine fear across the Great Plains. Ranchers who had once left their properties unlocked now installed floodlights and alarm systems. People who had lived their entire lives in rural isolation suddenly felt vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. The cattle mutilations had become more than a criminal mystery. They had become a psychological crisis that law enforcement had no tools to address. The cases continued through the fall of 1975, then began to decrease as mysteriously as they had started. By early 1976, new reports had slowed to a trickle. Whatever had swept through the heartland, killing and mutilating hundreds of cattle with impossible precision, seemed to have moved on or stopped. But it left behind traumatized communities, baffled investigators, and questions that remain unanswered decades later. The ranchers who lived through those years never forgot the fear, the helplessness, and the certainty that something beyond their understanding had visited their land and left only silence and mystery in its wake. The sound came first, not the thunderous chop of rotor blades echoing across canyon walls, but something else entirely. A low hum, barely perceptible, felt more in the chest cavity than heard with the ears. Ranchers across the American Southwest learned to recognize this sound in the 1970s, learned to dread it, learned that when dawn broke after such a night, they would likely find one of their animals dead in a way that defied every natural explanation. Tom Miller stood in his pasture, northeast of Sterling, Colorado on the morning of September 8, 1975, staring at what remained of his prize Hereford bull. The animal lay on its side, precisely mutilated, the surgical removal of organs executed with impossible precision. But Tom wasn't thinking about the bull just then. He was thinking about the previous night, about waking at 2 in the morning to that strange humming vibration, about walking to his bedroom window and seeing it hanging there above his eastern pasture. A black helicopter, completely unmarked, hovering impossibly still just 30 feet above his grazing land. No navigation lights, no identification numbers. Just a dark shape suspended against the starfield, silent except for that bone-deep hum. Tom had called the Logan County Sheriff's Office immediately. By the time a deputy arrived 20 minutes later, the helicopter had vanished. The deputy had been polite but skeptical, taking notes with the weary patience of a man who'd heard too many strange stories. But when the sun rose and they found the mutilated bull in the exact location where the helicopter had hovered, the deputy's skepticism transformed into something else, something closer to fear. Sheriff George Yarnell didn't dismiss Tom Miller's report. By September of 1975, Yarnell had investigated 17 cattle mutilations across Logan County. He documented the impossible precision of the cuts, the complete lack of blood, the surgical removal of organs with techniques that surpassed what most rural veterinarians could accomplish. And he'd heard the helicopter stories before. Not once or twice, but repeatedly, from credible witnesses, from ranchers and farmers he'd known for decades, people not given to flights of fancy or tall tales. But it was Sheriff Graves in Elbert County who truly broke the story open. A respected lawman with over 2 decades of experience, Graves went on record in 1975 with an account that would make him either a courageous truth-teller or a fool, depending on who was listening. He'd received reports of unmarked black helicopters in connection with 7 mutilation cases. Not random sightings, but specific observations made hours before mutilated cattle were discovered. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss. Graves described helicopters that violated everything he understood about aircraft. They hovered without sound, or with that strange low-frequency hum witnesses kept describing. They had no visible markings, no registration numbers, nothing to identify their origin or purpose. When he contacted every military installation within 200 miles, every law enforcement agency, every civilian helicopter service, the answer came back the same. No one had helicopters in those areas at those times. No one claimed responsibility. The denials were absolute, and to Sheriff Graves, completely unbelievable. The witnesses kept coming forward. Near Walsenburg, Colorado, rancher David Martinez reported seeing a black helicopter hovering over his southern fence line at dusk. He'd watched it for nearly 20 minutes, growing increasingly uneasy. The craft moved with unusual precision, seeming to focus on specific areas of his pasture. Martinez had cattle in that section. He'd considered driving out to check on them, but something about the helicopter's presence stopped him. An instinctive warning that whispered he should stay inside, stay away, pretend he hadn't seen anything. The next morning, he found 2 of his cows dead, mutilated with that now familiar surgical precision, in the exact area where the helicopter had concentrated its attention. But the helicopter sightings represented only one layer of the phenomenon. Other witnesses reported something that complicated the picture even further, something that pushed the mystery beyond conventional military operations into territory that challenged consensus reality itself. Outside of Dulce, New Mexico, ranchers began reporting lights in the sky. Not the distant pinpoints of commercial aircraft or the recognizable strobe patterns of military jets, but something entirely different. Orange orbs that pulsated with internal luminescence, craft that moved with impossible acceleration, lights that seemed to dance and weave across the night sky with purposeful intelligence. And these lights appeared on the same nights that mutilations occurred. Manuel Gomez stood in his field on the night of June 13, 1976, watching an orange light drift silently across his property. The light was perhaps 50 feet above the ground, moving slowly over his grazing cattle. The animals reacted strangely, clustering together, their usual evening sounds silenced. Manuel felt his skin prickle, felt a static charge building in the air around him. The light pulsated, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that seemed almost biological. Almost like breathing. He watched it for 10 minutes before it suddenly accelerated, shooting upward and disappearing into the night sky at a speed no conventional aircraft could match. In the morning, He found one of his yearling calves dead, its jaw removed with surgical precision, not a drop of blood anywhere on the animal or the surrounding ground. This is where Officer Gabe Valdez enters the story, and his testimony transforms the mystery from scattered anecdotal reports into documented investigative evidence that demands explanation. Gabe Valdez served as a state patrol officer in Dulce, New Mexico, a small town on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation. Beginning in 1975 and continuing for years afterward, Valdez investigated numerous cattle mutilation cases in the Dulce area. But unlike many law enforcement officers who filed reports and moved on, Valdez became obsessed with finding answers. He documented everything with meticulous care. He photographed sites, took measurements, collected samples, interviewed witnesses, and what he found disturbed him deeply. Valdez documented helicopter activity repeatedly in connection with mutilation cases. He recorded the reports of witnesses who saw unmarked black helicopters in the hours before and after mutilations. But he went further. He found physical evidence. At multiple mutilation sites, Valdez discovered unusual ground impressions. 3 circular marks arranged in triangular patterns, suggesting tripod configurations. The impressions were deep, pressed into earth with significant weight. Valdez measured them, photographed them, made casts. He found these tripod patterns at site after site, always near the mutilated animal, sometimes accompanied by unusual ground disturbances, suggesting something heavy had landed and taken off. But Valdez also documented something that didn't fit the helicopter narrative. He found traces of a substance he couldn't identify at several sites. He collected samples and sent them for analysis. The results showed unusual chemical compositions that defied easy explanation. He found elevated radiation readings at some locations. He documented areas where vegetation appeared burned or withered in circular patterns around mutilation sites. In 1979, Valdez submitted a detailed report to the New Mexico State Police outlining his findings. The report documented years of investigation, dozens of cases, patterns that suggested either a coordinated surveillance operation of massive scope or something even more disturbing. He specifically noted the consistent presence of unmarked helicopters, the physical evidence of tripod impressions, the unusual chemical traces. He requested resources for further investigation, support from state and federal agencies, help in solving what had become an epidemic of livestock mutilations causing significant economic and psychological damage to ranchers in his jurisdiction. The response from government agencies was silence. Not the silence of investigation and classified information, but the silence of complete dismissal. When pressed, military officials denied any involvement in helicopter flights over the areas in question. The Air Force stated categorically that no military helicopters were operating in those regions during the time specified. The Department of Defense issued statements dismissing the entire mutilation phenomenon as the result of natural predation and overly imaginative witnesses. But the denials didn't match the evidence. Too many credible witnesses had seen the helicopters. Too many law enforcement officers, including Sheriff Graves and Officer Valdez, had documented the connection between aerial activity and mutilations. The government's blanket denials began to feel less like truth and more like calculated stonewalling. This created a disturbing possibility. If these were indeed military helicopters, then someone was lying at the highest levels. If the military was conducting some kind of surveillance or testing operation using civilian livestock without permission or explanation, it represented a violation of public trust so profound that the cover became necessary at any cost. But what if the witnesses were accurately reporting unmarked black helicopters, and the military's denials were truthful? What then? This question opens darker territory. If these craft appear to be helicopters but weren't military, what were they? The technology to create silent or nearly silent hovering craft existed in experimental form, but not in the numbers and frequency reported. And the technology to perform the surgical mutilations found on the cattle seemed beyond anything publicly acknowledged in the 1970s. Some researchers began proposing that the helicopters themselves were a screen memory, a psychological explanation for something witnesses couldn't fully process. That what appeared to be helicopters might be something else using technology that mimicked helicopters closely enough to create a conventional framework for an unconventional experience. The human mind, confronted with something truly unknown, reaches for the closest recognizable category. A hovering craft becomes a helicopter because helicopters hover. But what if the similarities ended there? Others suggested the helicopters were real, were conventional military craft, but were monitoring something else. That the mutilations themselves were being performed by something non-human, and the black helicopters represented a secret government effort to investigate or track these events. In this scenario, the military denials served to protect classified monitoring programs, studying a phenomenon they didn't understand and couldn't control. The Dulce area in particular became a nexus for these theories. The combination of Officer Valdez's documented findings, the high concentration of mutilation cases, the persistent reports of both helicopters and strange lights, created a mystery layered within mysteries. Rumors began circulating about underground facilities in the Dulce area, about secret installations where unexplained events were studied, or perhaps even orchestrated. What remains undeniable is the testimony of witnesses. Ranchers who risked ridicule to report what they'd seen. Law enforcement officers who documented evidence knowing it might damage their credibility. People who had nothing to gain and much to lose by coming forward with accounts of unmarked helicopters and strange lights hovering over their property in the hours before their livestock died in inexplicable ways. The phenomenon continues, even now, decades later. Reports still emerge of unmarked helicopters near mutilation sites. Lights are still seen in skies over ranch land on nights when animals die mysteriously. And the government's response remains the same measured denial, the same insistence that nothing unusual is occurring, that conventional explanations account for everything. But standing in a pasture at dawn, looking at an animal that's been surgically mutilated with impossible precision, with no blood, no tracks, no conventional explanation that fits the evidence, knowing that hours earlier a silent black craft hovered over this exact spot, knowing that your report will be dismissed and your credibility questioned, the official denials ring hollow. Something is happening in the night skies over America's ranchlands. Something that leaves physical evidence and traumatized witnesses. Whether it's a surveillance operation using advanced technology, a cover-up of something even more disturbing, or a phenomenon that transcends our current understanding of what's possible, the question remains unanswered, deliberately obscured by denial and silence, hanging over the mystery like those unmarked helicopters hang over darkened pastures, watching, waiting, present. The rancher arrived at dawn to find his prize Hereford cow lying dead in the pasture. Nothing unusual about that at first glance. Cattle die sometimes. But as he drew closer, the wrongness of the scene began to reveal itself in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cow's jaw had been stripped clean of flesh, exposing white bone that gleamed in the early morning light. One eye was gone, removed so completely that not a trace of ocular tissue remained in the socket. The udder had been excised with what appeared to be surgical precision. But it was the edges of these wounds that stopped him cold. They weren't ragged or torn like a predator attack. They weren't even clean like a sharp blade. They were something else entirely. The flesh appeared sealed, darkened, almost polished along every incision line. When Dr. John Altschuler examined one of the earliest documented cases in 1967, he brought with him the skepticism of a trained pathologist and the precision tools of modern medicine. What he discovered would fundamentally challenge his understanding of what was possible. Using a microscope to examine the tissue samples, he found something that shouldn't exist outside of a modern surgical suite. The cuts showed evidence of hemoglobin coagulation at the cellular level, consistent with exposure to extremely high temperatures applied with impossible precision. The incisions had been cauterized as they were made, sealed by heat so intense it crystallized the cell structure, yet so controlled it never spread beyond a microscopic margin. Dr. Altschuler was not a man given to wild speculation. He had performed thousands of autopsies. He knew what scalpels did to tissue. He knew what lasers looked like at the cellular level. This was neither. The technology to make such cuts, if it existed at all, was not available in 1967. It barely existed when he reviewed his findings decades later. The precision required would challenge the steadiest surgical hand, even in a controlled operating theater with the finest modern instruments. Yet this had been done to a 1,200-pound animal in an open field, likely in complete darkness, without restraint, without the beast making a sound loud enough to alert other cattle grazing nearby. Veterinary pathologist Dr. Kelleher spent 15 years investigating these cases across multiple states. His reports read like documents from another world. In case after case, he documented the same impossible characteristics. Incisions that showed no hesitation marks, no sawing motion, no tearing of the surrounding tissue. Organs removed through openings that were geometrically smaller than the organs themselves. In one case in Colorado, a cow's tongue had been removed entirely through an incision in the jaw, measuring just 3 inches across. The tongue of a mature cow weighs several pounds and measures over a foot in length. The mathematical impossibility of removing it through such a small opening without tearing, without leaving tool marks, without leaving blood, defied explanation. But it was the exsanguination that truly disturbed the forensic experts. Complete and total blood removal from animals weighing up to 1,500 pounds. A cow that size contains approximately 55 to 60 liters of blood. That's roughly 14 to 16 gallons. Enough blood that draining it would create a massive pool, soak into the ground, leave evidence everywhere. Yet at scene after scene, investigators found nothing. No blood in the animal. No blood on the ground. No blood on the surrounding vegetation. No blood trail leading away from the carcass. Rancher Manuel Sanchez in New Mexico tried to understand this himself. He had found 3 of his cattle mutilated over 2 years. The lack of blood bothered him more than anything else. After the 3rd incident, he conducted an experiment that would give him nightmares. He butchered one of his own steers using every method he could think of to minimize blood spillage. He hung it properly, bled it into containers, worked as cleanly as possible. Even with all his precautions, even with gravity helping drain the blood into controlled vessels, he still had blood everywhere. On his hands, his clothes, the ground, the tools. The comparison to what he'd found in the field wasn't even close. Whatever drained his mutilated cattle had achieved something he couldn't replicate with modern ranching equipment and a lifetime of experience. The Australian rancher David Cahill took the experiment further. After finding 2 mutilated sheep on his property in 1994, he became obsessed with understanding the precision of the cuts. He obtained the sharpest surgical scalpels he could purchase. He practiced on animal carcasses from his own stock that had died of natural causes. He tried to recreate the clean-sealed edges he'd seen on the mutilated animals. He failed completely. Even his sharpest blades, applied with steady pressure and all the time in the world, created cuts that looked crude by comparison. The edges were clean enough, yes, but they bled. The tissue separated in ways that looked nothing like the sealed, cauterized wounds on the mutilated sheep. And he was working in his barn with proper light, with the carcass secured and immobile, taking all the time he needed. Whatever created the wounds on animals found in open pastures did so without those advantages. Without light, without restraint, without time, and achieved results that surpassed his best efforts by an order of magnitude. Forensic veterinarian Dr. Elizabeth Morris examined over 40 cases across Wyoming and Montana between 2000 and 2015. Her testimony to local law enforcement was unequivocal and deeply unsettling. The procedures performed on these animals, she stated in her official reports, would require hours of work in a sterile surgical environment. The removal of organs through minimal incisions demands careful dissection, constant visualization, specialized tools. The complete exsanguination of a large animal requires either gravity drainage over an extended period or active pumping mechanisms. The cauterization of wounds requires heat sources that must be carefully controlled to avoid burning surrounding tissue. Yet these animals were being found in open fields, in mud during rainy seasons with no mud disturbed around the carcass, on hillsides where approach would require hours of hiking, in pastures where other cattle grazed, undisturbed mere yards away. The other animals showed no signs of panic, no indication they'd witnessed anything alarming. Ranchers who checked their herds in the evening would find nothing unusual. By morning, a perfectly mutilated carcass would appear, as if it had been worked on in a surgical theater and then transported, fully completed, to its final location. But the physical evidence argued against transportation. These were massive animals, dead weight that would require multiple people and equipment to move. Yet the ground beneath and around the carcasses showed no signs of dragging, no deep impressions from a body being dropped or placed. The animals appeared to have died exactly where they lay, dropped in position, and somehow operated on without disturbing anything around them. Dr. Morris attempted to recreate the organ removal in controlled conditions. Working with a donated cattle carcass, proper surgical lighting, and hours at her disposal, she tried to remove a liver through an incision matching those found on mutilated cattle. The liver of a cow weighs 8 to 12 pounds and has a specific shape that doesn't compress easily. The incision on the mutilated animal was roughly 4 inches long. After 3 hours of careful work, Dr. Morris had to admit defeat. She could remove portions of the liver through such an opening, but not the intact organ. She would have to either enlarge the incision significantly or section the liver into pieces, which would leave obvious cutting marks on the organ tissue itself. The mutilated cattle had their livers removed intact through impossibly small openings, with no additional cutting marks on the organs. The organs themselves were simply gone, as if pulled through the incision in defiance of spatial geometry. The rectum and colon removal presented another impossible puzzle. In multiple cases, the entire rectal and lower colon tissue had been removed in a clean, cord cylinder, extending up to 18 inches into the body cavity. Veterinary surgeon Dr. Thomas Brevard stated flatly that performing such a procedure on a living or recently deceased animal would require approaching from inside the body cavity. You would need to cut the attachments, remove the surrounding tissue, and extract the entire section. Doing it from the outside, through the external orifice, would be anatomically impossible without specialized tools that, to his knowledge, didn't exist. The tissue simply doesn't detach and extract that way. There are too many connecting points, too much surrounding structure. Yet, case after case showed exactly this impossible extraction. A perfect cylinder of tissue removed from the outside in, with cauterized edges, with no tearing, with no tool marks, with no blood. The silence bothered investigators almost as much as the physical evidence. Cattle are not quiet animals when distressed. They bellow, they thrash, they panic. A herd will react dramatically to a threat. Yet, in documented cases where mutilated animals were found within earshot of occupied ranch houses, nobody reported hearing anything unusual during the night. The other cattle in the herd showed no signs of agitation. Dogs that would bark at a coyote a quarter-mile away slept through whatever happened in the pasture. Rancher Tom Miller in Montana described checking on a pregnant heifer at 10 p.m. and finding her fine died alive. At 6 a.m., she was dead and mutilated. His bedroom window overlooked that pasture, less than 200 yards away. His 2 cattle dogs slept on the porch with a direct view of the field. Nobody heard anything. The dogs never barked. In the morning, a 1,200-pound animal had been subjected to what forensic analysis suggested would require hours of intensive surgical work, and it had all happened in perfect silence. The lack of scavenger activity added another layer of strangeness. Predators and scavengers normally find dead cattle within hours. Coyotes, vultures, even insects descend quickly on fresh carrion. But mutilated cattle often lay untouched for days. Ranchers reported finding carcasses that should have been swarming with blowflies in summer heat, yet had not a single insect on them. Vultures that would normally fight over such a feast circled overhead, but refused to land. Coyotes approached to within 50 yards and then retreated. When the carcasses finally did begin to decompose and attract scavengers, they did so suddenly, as if some invisible barrier had been removed. This behavior has no explanation in wildlife biology. Scavengers don't avoid fresh meat. They certainly don't avoid it for days, and then suddenly find it acceptable. The totality of the forensic evidence paints a picture that defies conventional explanation. Surgical precision beyond modern capability. Exsanguination without blood evidence. Organ removal that violates spatial geometry. Heat cauterization without burning. Silent operation in open fields. All accomplished on animals weighing over 1,000 pounds without sedation, without restraint, without leaving traces of human presence. The experts who have examined these cases most carefully, the veterinarians and pathologists and forensic scientists who have spent years studying the evidence, find themselves unable to offer comfortable explanations. They can document what was done. They can measure the precision. They can analyze the tissue samples. What they cannot do is explain how any of it is possible, or who or what possesses the capability to perform such procedures under such impossible conditions. The scientific analysis, rather than solving the mystery, only deepens it. The more carefully we examine what happened to these animals, the less sense any of it makes. When Senator Harrison Schmitt walked into the Senate chambers in early 1979, he carried with him something few politicians dared to acknowledge: a folder thick with reports of cattle mutilations from his home state of New Mexico. Schmitt was no ordinary senator. As a geologist and former Apollo 17 astronaut, he was a man of science, someone who understood the difference between fantasy and measurable reality. And what he had seen in the reports from ranchers, law enforcement, and veterinarians across New Mexico troubled him deeply enough to do something unprecedented. He demanded a federal investigation. The mutilations had been escalating throughout the 1970s, spreading like a dark stain across the American heartland. In New Mexico alone, dozens of cases had been documented, each one bearing the same inexplicable characteristics: organs removed with surgical precision, blood drained so completely that the ground beneath the carcasses remained unstained, cuts so clean they appeared to have been made with instruments far beyond what any rural prankster could obtain. Local law enforcement had exhausted their resources, and ranchers were losing not just livestock, but their sense of security. When Schmitt brought their concerns to Washington, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had little choice but to respond. In May of 1979, the FBI officially launched Operation Animal Mutilation. They assigned the case to retired FBI agent Kenneth Rommel, bringing him out of retirement specifically for this investigation. On paper, it seemed like a serious commitment to finding answers. The Bureau allocated funds, authorized Rommel to travel across New Mexico, and gave him access to federal resources. To the ranchers who had been pleading for help, it looked like validation was finally coming. Someone with the authority and expertise of the FBI would surely get to the bottom of this mystery that had haunted them for years. But those who watched Rommel work began to notice something troubling. His investigation seemed less focused on solving the mystery and more concentrated on explaining it away. From the beginning, Rommel appeared to approach each case with a predetermined conclusion, working backward to find evidence that would support the theory that natural predators were responsible. When ranchers pointed out the surgical precision of the cuts, Rommel suggested scavengers could create such wounds. When veterinarians noted the complete absence of blood, he proposed that decomposition and insect activity could account for it. When law enforcement officers described the lack of tracks around the carcasses, he implied they simply had not looked carefully enough. Dr. C.W. McElroy watched this unfold with increasing frustration. As a veterinarian who had examined dozens of mutilated cattle, McElroy understood animal pathology in ways that Rommel, despite his investigative credentials, did not. McElroy had been documenting cases for Project Stigma, a privately funded research initiative dedicated to cataloging and studying the mutilation phenomenon with actual scientific rigor. Where Rommel saw what he wanted to see, McElroy recorded what was actually there. Project Stigma had been established by researchers who recognized that official channels were failing to address the phenomenon seriously. They created detailed protocols for examining mutilated animals, photographing wounds from multiple angles, collecting tissue samples, and documenting environmental conditions at each site. McElroy's files grew thick with evidence that contradicted every simple explanation the authorities proposed. He found incisions that showed no tearing, no ragged edges, none of the characteristics of predator feeding. He documented the removal of specific organs, reproductive organs, eyes, tongues, ears, taken with a selectivity that no scavenger exhibited. He measured the internal cavity exposure and found that in many cases, organs had been extracted through impossibly small openings, as if removed before the incision was made. Most significantly, McElroy cataloged something that the official reports consistently ignored: the hemoglobin measurements. When he tested tissue samples from mutilated cattle, he found that the blood had not simply pooled elsewhere in the body or soaked into the ground. It was gone, completely absent in a way that violated everything known about decomposition and scavenger activity. Animals that die naturally or are killed by predators retain blood in their tissues and organs. The cardiovascular system does not simply empty itself. Yet, in case after case, McElroy found tissue samples that appeared to have been exsanguinated through a process that left no trace of how it had been accomplished. Rommel's final report, submitted to the FBI in June of 1980, ran to nearly 300 pages. Within those pages, every unusual characteristic had been explained away. The precise incisions were attributed to the stretching and tearing of sun-dried hide. The missing blood was blamed on natural settling and insect consumption. The absence of tracks was explained by hard ground and wind. The selectivity of organ removal was credited to the feeding preferences of various scavengers. And the pattern of cases, spreading across multiple states, was dismissed as mass hysteria, fueled by media attention. The conclusion was clear and unambiguous. Cattle mutilations were the result of natural predators and common scavengers, misidentified by inexperienced observers who had allowed fear and folklore to cloud their judgment. There was no mystery to solve, no crime being committed, no phenomenon requiring further investigation. The FBI closed Operation Animal Mutilation and filed the case away, satisfied that they had provided the answers Senator Schmidt had requested. But the ranchers who had been living with the mutilations knew differently. The law enforcement officers who had worked these cases for years read Rommel's report with disbelief. The veterinarians who had examined the evidence with their own trained eyes recognized the dismissal for what it was: a predetermined conclusion dressed up in official language. They had not imagined the surgical precision of the cuts they had seen. They had not misinterpreted the complete absence of blood. They had not failed to notice predator activity simply because they were rural folk unfamiliar with how animals die. Dr. McElroy continued his work with Project Stigma, knowing that the official narrative had been constructed to close a case rather than solve it. His documentation revealed a pattern that the FBI report had deliberately ignored. The mutilated animals were not randomly scattered across the landscape. They appeared in clusters, concentrated in specific areas during specific time periods, then shifting to new locations. The wounds were consistent from case to case, showing a repeatability that natural scavenger activity never exhibited. And most tellingly, the mutilations did not stop when the FBI declared them solved. 1980 came and went, and the reports continued. Ranchers in Colorado found mutilated cattle on their land. Montana reported new cases with the same inexplicable characteristics. Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, the phenomenon continued its spread despite the official conclusion that nothing unusual was happening. By the mid-1980s, thousands of additional cases had been documented, each one bearing the same features that Rommel's report had attributed to natural causes. The FBI did not reopen the investigation. Despite the mounting evidence, despite the continuing reports from credible witnesses, despite the documentation being compiled by researchers like McElroy, the Bureau maintained its position. The case was closed. The mystery was solved. Nothing more needed to be investigated. This pattern of official dismissal revealed something perhaps more disturbing than the mutilations themselves: a systematic unwillingness to confront a phenomenon that did not fit into conventional frameworks. Whether driven by bureaucratic inconvenience, fear of public panic, or something more calculated, the response from federal authorities established a template that would be repeated for decades. Investigate just enough to appear responsive, then craft a conclusion that protects the official narrative, regardless of how poorly it aligns with the evidence. Law enforcement officers in rural counties found themselves in an impossible position. They knew what they were seeing defied the FBI's explanation, but challenging federal conclusions meant professional ridicule. Veterinarians who spoke publicly about the unexplained features in their examinations were dismissed as attention seekers or incompetents who did not understand basic animal pathology. Ranchers who insisted that predators could not have caused the damage they witnessed were patronized as simple country folk frightened by natural processes they did not comprehend. The cases kept coming. Throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century, mutilations continued to be reported across North America and increasingly around the world. Each time, local investigators would document the same impossible features: bloodless carcasses, precise incisions, missing organs, absence of tracks, or signs of struggle. And each time, If the cases received any official attention at all, the conclusion remained unchanged. Natural predators. Scavengers. Decomposition. Nothing to investigate. Nothing to fear. Move along. Kenneth Rommel's investigation had accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. It had not solved the mystery of cattle mutilations. It had not provided answers that satisfied the people actually dealing with the phenomenon. But it had created an official record that could be cited whenever new cases emerged, a document that allowed authorities to dismiss concerns without conducting genuine investigation. The template had been set, and it would prove remarkably durable. What the official dismissal could not erase was the knowledge held by those who had seen the evidence firsthand. They knew what was being hidden, not through some grand conspiracy requiring hundreds of participants, but through the simple bureaucratic mechanism of predetermined conclusions and selective blindness. The mutilations were real. The evidence was unexplainable, and the pattern of official denial was as consistent as the phenomenon itself. The 5 bulls stood silent in the Oregon dawn, their massive bodies perfectly still against the volcanic soil of the Harney County rangeland. It was late September 2019, and Colby Marshall was making his morning rounds across the family property when he spotted them. Even from a distance, something looked wrong. The animals weren't grazing. They weren't moving at all. As he approached in his truck, his stomach dropped with a feeling he couldn't quite name, something primal and ancient that made the hair on his arms stand up. What he found that morning would connect him to a nightmare that has never ended, a phenomenon that refuses to fade into history or surrender to rational explanation. The bulls, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, lay positioned across the property in a pattern that defied natural death. Their blood was gone, completely. Not pooled beneath them, not soaked into the earth, but absent, as if it had been methodically extracted from their massive bodies. The cuts were surgical, geometrically precise, removing specific organs and body parts with an exactness that stunned the veterinarians who later examined them. Eyes, tongues, reproductive organs, all removed with what appeared to be laser-like precision. The edges of the incisions showed evidence of extreme heat, cauterized in a way that local ranchers, veterinarians, and law enforcement had never encountered in cases of predation or even sophisticated poaching. But here's what truly terrified the Marshall family and the investigators who arrived in the following days. These weren't new characteristics. These were identical to cattle mutilation cases documented in the exact same region 50 years earlier. Down to the smallest detail, these 2019 deaths matched the pattern that had terrorized ranchers across the American West during the 1970s. The phenomenon that was supposed to have been solved, explained away as natural predation, or satanic, cult activity, or elaborate hoaxes, was happening again, with the exact same impossible features. The Oregon State Police took the unusual step of issuing a public request for information, acknowledging that the deaths were not consistent with normal predator activity. Deputy Dan Jenkins, a 20-year veteran who had investigated countless livestock deaths, told reporters that he had never seen anything like this. The lack of blood, the surgical precision, the absence of tracks or evidence around the carcasses, it all pointed towards something beyond his experience or training. What he didn't say in those official statements, what he later shared with colleagues, was that reviewing the old case files from the 1970s gave him chills. The cases were identical, separated by 4 decades, but connected by details that couldn't be coincidental. Modern ranchers weren't taking chances. In the years following the Oregon incidents, cattle operations across North America began installing sophisticated security systems, trail cameras that could detect heat signatures from hundreds of yards away, motion-activated HD cameras with night vision capabilities. Some ranchers went further, installing networks of cameras that covered entire pastures, investing thousands of dollars in technology that could, theoretically, capture whatever was responsible for these mutilations. Tom Miller, who runs a cattle operation outside of Sweetwater, Texas, installed 12 cameras across his property in early 2020. He positioned them strategically, creating overlapping fields of coverage that left virtually no blind spots across his grazing land. The system could be monitored from his phone, with alerts sent whenever motion was detected. He felt confident, protected by technology that hadn't existed during the original wave of mutilations. On a February night in 2021, Tom received no alerts. His cameras recorded nothing unusual. But at dawn, he found one of his heifers in the northeast pasture, mutilated in a manner identical to the Oregon bull's. The tongue had been removed through a precise oval incision. One eye was gone, extracted without damage to the surrounding tissue. The reproductive organs had been excised with cuts so clean they appeared surgical. And there was no blood, not beneath the animal, not in the surrounding grass, nowhere. Tom immediately checked his camera system. The heifer was clearly visible in the footage from the previous evening, grazing normally. Then, for a period of exactly 47 minutes, all 3 cameras with a view of that area showed nothing but static. Not darkness, not normal footage, but electronic interference that disrupted the recording. When the cameras resumed normal operation, the heifer was already on the ground, already mutilated. The procedure that removed organs and drained blood from a 600-pound animal had occurred during a blackout that affected only the cameras aimed at that specific location. The other 9 cameras scattered across the property functioned normally throughout the entire night. This wasn't an isolated technological failure. Ranchers from Montana to New Mexico, from Colorado to California, reported the same phenomenon. Security systems would malfunction during mutilation events. Trail cameras would go offline. Motion sensors would fail to trigger. In some cases, cameras would continue recording but capture absolutely nothing, even as the mutilation occurred within their field of view. It was as if whatever was responsible for these incidents could detect and disable surveillance technology, or operated in a way that made detection impossible. Meanwhile, in Argentina, a parallel nightmare was unfolding. The South American mutilations had been documented since the 1960s, but in recent years they had intensified, matching the North American surge with eerie synchronicity. Carlos Yurchuk, a rancher in the province of Corrientes, found 3 cows mutilated on his property in March of 2022. The characteristics were identical to the North American cases. Precise incisions, missing organs, no blood. But what made Carlos's case particularly significant was the involvement of SENASA, Argentina's National Service of Agri-Food Health and Quality. SENASA sent forensic veterinarians to examine the carcasses. These weren't local officials or generalists, but trained experts in animal pathology who conducted detailed necropsies. Their report, made public in May of 2022, stated that the cuts showed evidence of exposure to high temperatures, that the precision of the incisions was inconsistent with predation or scavenging, and that the absence of blood was medically inexplicable. They found no evidence of conventional weapons or tools. The report stopped short of offering an explanation, simply documenting that the deaths were anomalous and inconsistent with any normal cause. What struck investigators was how the Argentine cases matched the North American pattern exactly, despite occurring thousands of miles apart in different ecosystems with different predator populations. The same organs were targeted. The same precision was evident. The same impossible absence of blood characterized every case. Whatever was responsible for the mutilations in Oregon and Texas was also active in the grasslands of South America, or the phenomenon had multiple sources operating with identical methodology. Modern investigators brought tools that would have seemed like science fiction to their 1970s counterparts. Drones equipped with thermal imaging could survey vast areas and detect heat signatures invisible to the human eye. Portable DNA analysis could identify biological material at the scene. Advanced forensic techniques could detect trace evidence that previous generations of investigators might have missed. Chuck Zukovsky, a microchip engineer turned cattle mutilation investigator, used modified radiation detectors and GPS mapping to search for patterns in mutilation sites. Others employed soil sampling techniques, searching for chemical signatures or unusual compounds. They found the same unexplainable evidence that had baffled investigators 50 years earlier. Elevated radiation readings at some sites. Unusual mineral deposits in the soil near carcasses. In some cases, subtle disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field. But nothing conclusive. Nothing that pointed toward a definitive answer or identified a responsible party. The technology had advanced by orders of magnitude, but the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. What makes the ongoing nature of these incidents truly horrifying is the implication that spans decades. This isn't a historical curiosity or a solved case that we can file away as a peculiar chapter in rural American history. This is active. This is happening right now, as animals graze in fields across multiple continents, as ranchers invest in security systems that mysteriously fail, as investigators apply cutting-edge forensic science, only to encounter the same impossible evidence. The ranchers who discover these mutilated animals aren't reading about old cases or investigating historical mysteries. They're finding their livestock dead in ways that defy explanation, dealing with financial losses and psychological terror that comes from knowing something happened on their property that they cannot understand or prevent. The Marshall family in Oregon lost 5 breeding bulls worth thousands of dollars each. Insurance doesn't cover unexplained deaths, especially deaths this strange. The financial impact compounds the psychological trauma of finding animals you've raised subjected to procedures that appear almost surgically experimental. And the mutilations show no signs of stopping. Reports continue to emerge from rural areas, often underreported because ranchers fear ridicule, or because local authorities are reluctant to acknowledge cases they cannot solve. In 2022 alone, documented cases were reported from Montana, South Dakota, Kansas, Texas, California, and Oregon in North America, as well as Argentina, Brazil, and Puerto Rico internationally. The actual number is likely far higher, as many ranchers choose not to report incidents that they know will generate no answers and potentially negative attention. What keeps investigators like Chuck Zukowski and organizations like the Mutual UFO Network engaged with this phenomenon is the consistency of the pattern. After reviewing hundreds of cases spanning 5 decades, they find the same characteristics appearing with mechanical regularity. The precision cuts. The missing organs, always the same ones. The absence of blood. The lack of tracks or signs of struggle. The technological failures during events. These aren't random occurrences that happen to share a few similarities. These are events following a specific protocol, executed with a precision that suggests intelligence and purpose. We are now more than 50 years into a phenomenon that has never been adequately explained. 50 years during which technology advanced from analog photography to artificial intelligence, from basic forensics to DNA analysis, from simple cameras to satellite surveillance. And yet we are no closer to understanding what is happening in these remote pastures. The mutilations continue with the same impossible characteristics: immune to detection, resistant to explanation, ongoing despite our best efforts to capture evidence or identify the responsible party. The realization is deeply unsettling. Whatever is doing this operates with impunity, undeterred by investigation, apparently capable of disabling or evading our surveillance technology, executing procedures on large animals that our veterinary experts cannot replicate or explain. It has continued for half a century without being identified, caught, or stopped. The ranchers installing cameras are not protecting their herds. The investigators applying forensic science are not getting closer to answers. The phenomenon adapts, or was always beyond our capacity to understand. And tonight, somewhere in a dark pasture, another animal may be standing under stars that have witnessed this mystery play out thousands of times. Tomorrow, a rancher will make the discovery that connects them to a nightmare that stretches back decades and forward into an unknown future. The cattle mutilations never stop. They are happening now, active and ongoing, unexplained and unstoppable, a phenomenon that refuses to yield to time or technology or human understanding. The highway stretches empty under a dark Montana sky. A rancher climbs into his truck at dawn, coffee thermos in hand, heading out to check on his herd like he has for 30 years. But this morning will be different. This morning, he will find one of his cattle lying motionless in the pasture, its body surgically altered with a precision that will defy explanation. He will call the sheriff, who will document the case, file the report, and add it to a growing stack of identical incidents that spans decades. And like every case before it, this one will never be solved. We have journeyed through the dark landscape of cattle mutilations, examining the evidence, hearing from witnesses, and exploring theories that range from the prosaic to the extraordinary. But we arrive here at the only honest conclusion possible. We still do not know what is happening. The mystery endures because the evidence refuses to conform to any single explanation. Consider the surgical precision. Veterinary pathologists, experienced surgeons, and forensic experts have examined these animals and reached a disturbing consensus. The cuts are too perfect. Tissue removal around the eyes, ears, tongue, and reproductive organs shows a level of exactitude that exceeds standard veterinary capabilities, especially under field condition. The edges of these incisions appear cauterized at a microscopic level, suggesting extreme heat applied with impossible control. No scalpel marks. No hesitation cuts. No errors. Just perfect geometric removal of specific organs, executed with a skill that seems beyond human capability, particularly when performed in darkness on a living, or recently living, animal in an open field. Then there is the silence. Thousands of cattle have been found mutilated, often within earshot of ranch houses, sometimes in pastures bordered by homes. Yet almost no one hears anything. Cattle are not quiet animals when distressed. They bellow. They run. Shout. They alert the herd. But in case after case, ranchers report complete silence on the nights their animals are taken. Dogs that bark at distant coyotes remain mysteriously quiet. Motion sensor lights fail to trigger. Security systems register nothing. It is as if the events occur in a bubble of enforced stillness. The lack of physical evidence compounds the impossibility. No footprints approach the carcasses, even in soft mud or snow. No tire tracks. No tool marks beyond the surgical incisions themselves. No blood at the scene despite the removal of organs and tissue that should leave evidence of hemorrhage. The bodies often show signs of being dropped from a height, with broken bones consistent with impact, yet there are no vehicle tracks, no helicopter reports, no logical explanation for how a 1,000-pound animal could be lifted, operated upon, and deposited back in the field without leaving a trace. And the aerial phenomena persist. Orange lights, unmarked helicopters appearing in restricted airspace, beams of light witnessed by multiple observers, radar anomalies documented by law enforcement. These sightings cluster around mutilation events with statistical regularity that defies coincidence, yet no agency claims responsibility, and no conventional explanation accounts for the pattern. Most haunting is the consistency. From the Snippy case in 1967 to incidents reported last year, the pattern remains unchanged. The same organs removed. The same bloodless precision. The same absence of evidence. The same aerial phenomena. This is not the work of random predators or opportunistic hoaxers. This is systematic, methodical, ongoing. We have examined the theories, cult activity, satanic rituals, organized groups performing ceremonial slaughter. But cults leave evidence. They use tools that leave marks. They make mistakes. They get caught. In 50-plus years of documented mutilations, spanning thousands of cases across multiple continents, not one perpetrator has been apprehended. Not one cult member has confessed or been exposed. The operational security required to maintain such activities without a single breach strains credulity. Government bioweapon testing. Black budget programs monitoring disease vectors or testing surgical techniques. This theory accounts for the precision and the apparent aerial involvement, but it fails to explain the sheer scope. Why would any government program continue identical operations for over 5 decades? Why target cattle on foreign soil? Why maintain such elaborate secrecy for tests that could be conducted in controlled facilities? And if such a program existed, why would it persist unchanged for so long, with no evolution in technique or apparent objective? The extraterrestrial hypothesis. Unknown entities, conducting biological research on terrestrial species. This theory, dismissed by many as fringe thinking, nonetheless addresses elements the other theories cannot. It accounts for the superhuman precision, the advanced technology implied by the cauterization, the aerial phenomena, and the complete absence of conventional evidence. It explains why the pattern persists unchanged across decades and continents. But it requires accepting a premise that challenges our fundamental understanding of our place in the universe. Yet none of these theories, not one, fully explains the forensic evidence. Each addresses some elements while failing to account for others. We are left with a phenomenon that seems designed to resist explanation, as if whatever is responsible operates just beyond the reach of our investigative capabilities. The statistics alone should demand answers. Over 10,000 documented cases, hundreds of millions of dollars in livestock losses, congressional hearings, FBI investigations, state-level task forces, decades of law enforcement effort across multiple nations. And the solution rate remains zero. Not low. Zero. In the entire documented history of cattle mutilations, not a single case has been definitively solved with evidence leading to arrest and conviction. Ranchers still wait to find their cattle surgically mutilated. It happened last month. It will happen next month. The phenomenon has not stopped. It has not slowed. It continues with the same eerie precision it has demonstrated since the 1960s, indifferent to our investigations, our theories, our surveillance efforts, and our desperate need for answers. Something or someone has been conducting precise biological operations on livestock for over 50 years with complete impunity. They operate in darkness, but leave evidence in daylight. They display technology or capability beyond our conventional understanding. They maintain operational security that intelligence agencies would envy. And they continue, year after year, undeterred and unexplained. We do not know who is responsible. We do not know why they are doing this. We do not know how they achieve such precision while leaving no trace. And perhaps most disturbing of all, we do not know when or if it will ever stop. The mystery endures, unsolved and undiminished, a dark question mark hanging over rural communities worldwide. And in that uncertainty lies a profound unease. Because if something can operate with such impunity for this long, conducting surgical procedures on large animals without detection or consequence, what else might be possible that we simply have not yet discovered? The fields remain. The cattle graze. The ranchers watch and wait. And somewhere in the darkness, the phenomenon continues. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.